Hello! Today we are talking about how not to answer moral questions. This is a pretty straightforward essay. When you read the essay, you should have seen the headers, and underneath the headers, the explanation. And this essay is basically going to talk about the things we're not going to do in this class. Um, let's just start. The very first one is moral judgments and personal preferences. This section should have reminded you of the nature of ethical disagreement. Because when he's calling personal preferences is what Stevenson, in The Nature of Ethical Disagreement, called attitudes. And we never stay on the level of attitudes. Why? Everybody knows their preference, their emotional reaction to something, but that is not a basis of which to carry on an ethical discussion. Just because you like Kim Kardashian and someone else doesn't like Kim Kardashian, that's a preference. What you need to get at is why and the belief underneath it. So you don't stay on the level of what this author calls preferences. Always go deeper. All right. The second one is, I didn't remember what order it was in. Why thinking it so does not make it so. Okay. You wouldn't think you'd have to explain these, but you kind of do. If you've ever met someone who seems to believe that just because the thought pops into their head, that it's accurate. If the thought pops into their head, then it must be true because they thought it. That's not a basis for an ethical belief. Just because the thought pops into your head doesn't mean it's accurate, doesn't mean it's true. You have to analyze it. You have to think about it. You have to put more thought into it. You can't just say, well, must be right. I just thought it. So, watch out for that. And this isn't just you. Watch out for you, but also when you're having a discussion with someone, this will help you keep in mind what's going on. And you can kind of figure out where people are coming from, if they're just repeating it because they thought it, or whether they like it or dislike it. You can start recognizing the aspects of an ethical discussion by recognizing these things. All right, the next one, the irrelevance of statistics. So what does the author mean by statistics? He just means majority rules, if the majority thinks so. So is it a good idea to base your ethical beliefs on the majority of people? Well, if the majority of people think you shouldn't wear Speedos to class, you should not wear Speedos to class. Well, don't wear Speedos to class. But forgetting that, just because the majority of it think it, the majority of it you have a personal preference, don't do that, doesn't make it accurate. Because as we have seen historically, the majority can be wrong, and they are. So you can't just assume that if the majority of people think it and the majority of think this is moral or immoral, that it's actually moral or immoral. The majority of people thought slavery was right at the time of slavery. Did that make it right? No, it just meant that the majority of people thought so. So, just because a lot of people think something, or a lot of people think this is moral or immoral, doesn't make it actually moral or immoral. All right. Then we get to the last one, which is a bit more complicated. The appeal to moral authority. So let's imagine you're having a conversation with somebody. And you want to talk about the ethics of wearing Speedos to class. Okay? So, you have two people. One person is an atheist, and one person is a theist. Theist meaning someone that believes in one God. So let's make that person a Christian. I'm going to play both parts. I haven't gone insane, so it's going to go something like that. You see somebody walk by in Speedos. Let's say the Christian says, "That is so immoral. Did you see that? You are not supposed to do that." And the atheist says, "Well, why not? He's proud of his body. He's showing it off." And the Christian might say something along the lines of, "Well, you're supposed to be modest." you're not supposed to show that much of your body to other people. It's supposed to be a special thing between a husband and wife, so you're not supposed to walk around that way. And the atheist says, well, okay, where did you get this info? And you're like, well, I got it from my belief in God and the Bible, because that's what I believe in. And the atheist says, well, I don't believe in the Bible, so I don't recognize it as a basis for morality. I'm actually more sympathetic to nudists who say, you came into the world naked and enjoy yourself. Now, how is this conversation going to continue? If these people continue talking, are they going to talk about the Speedos, or are they going to talk about whether or not you should or should not believe in God, and why not? So the Christian might say, well, have you really considered your beliefs? I mean, have you never felt the presence of God? And the theist is going to, or the atheist is going to say, no, the closest I come to is being in nature, where I feel oneness in the world. And the Christian might say, well, that is God. And he's going to be like, no, it's not. And then you're going to discuss whether or not God exists or doesn't exist. And the conversation is going to turn from an ethical discussion into a theological discussion. Theological discussions are ones where you're using religion and specific religions, specific beliefs in God to discuss, in this case, ethical items. And you are discussing it as religion as a basis for the morality. That is a theology class. It is not a philosophy/ethics class. So we're not going to do that in this class. That is not to say that if you are religious, I'm asking you to just never refer to it. Because in real life, if you are religious, your religion is going to provide you with a set of moral beliefs. And that's the way it works. I mean, it's just the way it works. So if you are religious, you are welcome on the discussion board to talk about it, but you have to keep in mind that you have to follow the rules of an ethical discussion. So you need to talk about not whether or not specifically your religion, but in the essay, you should remember the section where he talks about, well, if God shows up and says, do not wear Speedos. Thou shalt not wear Speedos. Okay, so now we have a commandment. Is that commandment God's preference, God's attitude, or God's belief? Well, the reality is we don't know. You would have to be able to ask God, well, why don't you want people to wear Speedos? And then you would find out God's belief, and if God's belief is it's moral or it's immoral, you find out why it's moral and immoral, and then you have an ethical standard of which God is expressing. But you don't know that God is expressing an ethical standard. So, you can't go strictly by God said it in an ethics class, because we don't know why God is saying it. So if you're having a discussion with someone and your belief is coming from your religion, and you need to turn the topic away from religion and back into ethics, I want you to think about why God might think that whatever you're talking about is moral or immoral. Because you should be talking about the ethics of Speedo wearing, instead of turning the conversation into a religious conversation or whether or not God exists or not. And if you have a conversation where both people are religious, but think about it, one person believes in Gideon's translation and one person believes in King James, you're still going to have an issue because there are differences in the translations. And the conversation, more often than not, will end up in a conversation about which translation is correct and why. So when you're using God as a moral authority in ethical discussions, it tends to turn the discussion from an ethical one into a theological one. And this is why we're not doing it in this class. It's not to say that don't be religious. It's not even to say don't talk about it. But if you are religious and you do base it on your religion, you should be able to and willing to ask, well, why does God think this is moral, immoral, and talk about that, which should get you back on topic, back into an ethical discussion. And that is the last of the categories under how not to answer moral questions. So at this point in the semester, you now have what you need to know to continue to have ethical discussions. At the beginning of the semester, you know how to analyze the ethical discussion that we did in Nature of Ethical Disagreement. You know some basics in logic and fallacies to look out for. So you're going to use reason. And these 4 items from how not to answer moral questions are the things you are not going to do in an ethical discussion. So if somebody says to you, why do you believe that you shouldn't wear Speedos to class? You cannot answer, or if you do answer, let's say you answer, because the majority of people don't like it. If you say that, you then have to recognize that you've just given an answer that is inaccurate. Just because the majority of people think it does not make it immoral. You have to dig deeper and ask yourself, why don't people like it? And does that make it immoral? To keep the conversation, because we're practicing keeping the conversations kind of on track on the ethical issues that we're going to talk about. So I hope this helped, and I'm looking forward to reading your post about this essay. Have a good one.